So my first question to you is, when did you arrive at Wheaton College?
I arrived in August, September of 1979.
And what department were you?
I was assigned to the philosophy department.
I see. So, what transpired with your time at Wheaton, early on in your time at Wheaton, that opened the way to the emergence of the Center for Applied Christian Ethics?
And as you mentioned that question to me a few days ago, one way of characterizing what transpired was that there's a whole constellation of kairos moments. That kairos moment means it's like a God moment. It's something that you didn't see coming, but it opened up awareness, opened up opportunity, opened up even awareness of need and vacuum, that where something had to be brought in.
I see.
So if I could mention some
Please.
of those. I think one that stands out was at the time of the dedication of the Billy Graham Center, which I think was the fall of '80, so my second fall here. When I saw the announcement that Charles Malik was going to give the dedicatory message, that rang lots of bells for me. This man was a professor of philosophy at the University of Beirut, Lebanon, back when Lebanon was the Paris of the Middle East. Beirut was the Paris of the Middle East. And during the World War II, he realized that we need to have a whole different approach to peacemaking. So he was one of the crafters of the UN Charter. And he also served as ambassador from Lebanon for a couple of decades. And along the way was president of Security Council, was president of the General Assembly, had every major position at some point other than Secretary General. So a very influential man. And an outspoken Christian man. A profound Christian philosopher. So when I saw this announcement, I immediately contacted the president, President Armadin. And I said, I see that you're bringing Charles Malik on campus. In addition to his dedication, what else are we doing? And the president said, oh, nothing. Well, I said, how about a philosophy club meeting with one of the philosophers of our time that has changed the world? Oh, yeah, we could do that. How about having him speak to the faculty? Wow. So I said, how can we arrange this? He said, I'll give you his number. You call him. If he agrees, we'll do it. So guess who was his host on campus? But I could give some details, but his talk in the faculty, do you remember that, Dorothy? It was earth-shaking. It was radical. He stirred it up in a big way, whether you liked him or not. Why don't I tell you just a brief part of the story? I introduced him, and then he got up and talked for like 5 minutes, and sat down. So I said, are you open to for people to ask questions? He said, sure. So he gets up to the podium, and I remember who, but I won't name names here. But one professor said, please tell us how to integrate Christian faith and international relationships. And Malik stared at this person and said, that's a dumb question. This is a faculty member, by the way, a chair of a department, I might add. So I said, well, are there any other questions? And another chair of a department raised her hand, I'll not be specific, but said, how does the study of international relationships and biblical study, how do these integrate? Same question, just warmed over.
Right.
And he said, I thought Wheaton was a good school. That's the worst question I've ever heard. So I'm in charge of this meeting. I invited everybody. We have 150 faculty there. So I either had to say, hey, let's go for the cookies and coffee, right? Or I'd better come up with a pretty good question myself. So I said to him, may I ask a question? You have a deserved, excellent reputation as an international statesman that gets good things happening. And you have an amazing, consistent reputation as a Christian gentleman. How do those aspects of your life merge? Pretty good question? He said, great question. Now, what's the difference? Now, I'm a professional philosopher. I'm an intellectual, but I'm not an intellectualist. I like his gutsy way of doing Christian service, to really walk with Jesus in the halls of the UN and change the UN. And I can tell you a dozen ways in which he was an awesome Christian witness at the UN. But here's what he said, and I've never forgotten. I've never said the Lord's Prayer the same since then. And this is in 1980. He said two things. He said, I realized as soon as I got to the UN that you can't make a good decision at the UN. You can only choose the less bad decision. And so I would plead at the UN for God's wisdom to help to sort out, of all the bad decisions, what's the less bad, or the least bad, if it's three or more. And he said, second, every night I fall on my knees and ask God's forgiveness for making all those bad decisions, even the least bad. I thought, wow. So from then on, I pray, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven, in a very different way. Now, I got pushback from lots of people for even inviting him at this point. But a lot of people were just thrilled that he just cut through a lot of garbage, and I think said it the way we all end up having to live it.
So what are a couple of the other Kairos moments?
President Armending pushed hard that same year, 80-81, to have a rule that if anyone got divorced, they would lose their tenure. Or if anyone, after being divorced or divorcing somebody, remarried, they would lose their tenure. And he pushed hard for that. And he got a lot of people at a special meeting that everyone was required to be at. He got a lot of people endorsing his idea. Such a bad idea to endorse, I think. And I'm sitting in the back, and the whole faculty is in this three-quarters circle, 3 or 4 rows in the admin wing, and I'm just seething. Now, I had a great relationship with Armending. I was the chairman of the Spiritual Life Committee, and he would call on me to give advice on lots of things, and I would get his advice. So we had an excellent relationship. But he didn't ask for my endorsement of this. I was not a tenured professor. I was just now on my second year. But it was so bothersome. People would stand up and say, well, Jesus said whoever divorces someone, it's like committing adultery. And we don't want adulterers teaching our students, so therefore anyone who's divorced should not teach our students. Very simple modus ponens logic, but not applicable. So, but I had my hand up between every speaker, then both hands, and he still wasn't calling on me. So just as he was about to say, we'll have one more speaker, I stood up. Because I had to say something. And everyone saw me stand up because it's this, three-quarter circle. So almost everybody can see me standing up. So Armending says, okay, Paul, you're the last one. So I said, I have 2 problems. Dr. Armending, I appreciate your wisdom and your moral concern, but I have 2 big problems with this. One is you're treating the biblical sentences as if they're logical propositions, and that's already a decision in hermeneutics that we don't have to assume. Therefore, applying modus tollens is inappropriate. If anyone wants to know more about that, talk to me afterwards. The second point is that where Jesus says, whoever divorces cause that person or himself commits adultery, in the same text it says, whoever looks at a person of the opposite sex with lust commits adultery. So I said, please, would everyone who has never looked at anyone with lust, would you please stand? Almost everyone started laughing. And I looked, and someone who had just made this big speech on that text, just staring at me with bullets coming out of his eyes. And I looked in his direction. I remember who it was, but I looked in his direction and I said, and Jesus also says that being angry with a brother is like murder. Now, even Dr. Emmerding laughed. All right? So then I said, the point is that Jesus is not a new Moses. He's saying these things to awaken us that even if we pass 4 out of the 6 things he lists there, or only 3 out of the 6, we equally need a Savior. The issue is not that I'm a 5 out of 6 person, and someone else is a 4 out of 6, someone else is a 3 out of 6, but that we're all flawed and of need of a Savior. So I said, Dr. Armerding, please, let's make it a matter of prayer with if anyone gets a divorce or talks about divorce. Pray with them, meet with them, and seek God's wisdom in every case. But we don't need a policy. Please don't have a policy. The Bible does not support it. So Armerding says, okay, faculty council will meet on this and we'll make an announcement soon and had a prayer to dismiss the faculty. Well, as soon as it was dismissed, there were people that tripped over chairs to hug me. And some of them were people that had been divorced. But others too. And saying I was crazy. They were grateful for me. I was crazy because I wasn't tenured. Why was I being so bold? But I've always been that way. To me, to have a moral voice is a calling. So anyway, I'm watching the news updates. What was the rag that came out once a week with the president's office information? I forget what it was called. But put in our box in the post office. But nothing. Weeks went by. Months went by. Nothing. Now, everyone on the faculty council was sworn to secrecy. But I caught a member of the faculty council in an off moment. I said, what's happening with the policy on divorce? And he said, it comes up at every meeting. But the president can't get out of his head what you said. Isn't that amazing? And this is a strong-willed guy who I admire still.
I've heard this, yes.
Yes? So anyway, but I think it helps stir up an awareness that ethics isn't about rules, first of all. It's about godliness, and it's about character, and it's about doing the right thing. So, in the end, months later, maybe 6 months later, the President issued a statement that we decided not to have a policy. We will meet with every person going through marital crises. We will meet with prayer, and we will seek God's wisdom for good decisions. Ever heard that before? I said, praise the Lord. Right? So that's too. When I came to Wheaton, I shared this with Dr. Bacote earlier too. Here I was a kind of ethics expert in terms of applied ethics, the epistemology of applied ethics, how we know we're making a good decision or know we're not making a good decision. That's pretty crucial. And so within a week, the Bible theology department took me out to lunch to impress on me that the basic theme of the scripture on ethics is love. Everything else falls under love. Faith, accountability, justice, everything is under the theme of love. God is love, covers everything. I thought, well, that's pretty clever. But I never felt compelled to have a one principle approach to ethics. So within a week, philosophy department, which I was assigned to, they took me out to lunch. And the chairman of the department went on and on about, we study the scriptures carefully, and justice is the key theme of all of scripture. And love is under justice, and accountability and paying attention. They're all under the principle of justice. So we want to join our commitment to justice. Since you're part of the department, this is where we are. Join us in this. And I refused to commit myself. I said, I didn't mention the Bible department, and they're paying for lunch for me to get their ideas across. So I said, let me think about it. And now I love the Bible. I memorized most of the New Testament as a teenager. So I knew my way around. But now as I'm rereading, seeking God's wisdom, I notice that 3 different times Jesus says, this is the whole law of the prophets. And one has to do with love. Another one has to do with justice, the golden rule. And another one has to do with accountability. Loving God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength. And fourth, the Great Commission doubly emphasizes paying attention. Literally, Jesus says, teach everyone to be vigilant about what I commanded. Not just to obey, but to be vigilant. Be constantly thinking about it. Recognizing that Jesus is walking with us. Are we vigilant about what he taught? And then the next line is, look, or behold, or lo, I am with you every day till the end of the age. So in that last half, the Great Commission, double emphasis on paying attention, which is, I think, the 4th core principle. So I went back to both groups, and I said, you're right. Love is a basic theme of Scripture. And they caught that I said a basic theme. So I said, I'm with you on love. But I think it's also justice, accountability, and paying attention. And by the way, it's not only Jesus' emphasis on those 4 points, but Micah 6:8. What does the Lord require of you? Pay attention. Watch what's going on. But to do justice, love mercy, walk humbly with your God. There you're paying attention. Justice, love, and accountability all in one sentence. So I think I, at the same time, kind of put these 2 departments on notice a bit. That I wasn't simply going along with a lovely game, but at the same time affirming what they were saying, even if it's in a greater context. But at any rate, I think that these whole issues became regular points of discussion. I think another huge area is that business ethics was introduced as a required course in the business department. Then I think it became an optional course. And then I was the co-teacher with that. And just at the same time, Society for Business Ethics was being founded with the primary leaders all in Chicago, especially at Loyola of Chicago and DePaul. And so I connected with them. I became an officer from the beginning. And they were a cornucopia of great speakers and experts to help us through. And related to that, and then we could talk more, but one other awesome moment. I think it was our 2nd annual meeting of Society for Business Ethics. They convinced me that we should invite the president of Illinois Bell, who was becoming president of Ameritech, which is now called AT&T. But it was a Baby Bell company. And this guy was just, they said, I'd never heard of him, never met him, but they said, you will love him. He's a man of great integrity. He's creative in doing ethical things through his company. It's not just he's following the law and not getting into trouble, but he's looking for ways that his leadership of Illinois Bell, and now with Ameritech, which is the Bell company for the whole Midwest. So I said, I'm looking forward to seeing him. So I'm sitting there during this main speech. I had my own made paper for the event, but he's the keynote speaker, and I am moved. I read about him, but now hearing his voice, he's seeing how he explains his position, I'm absolutely moved. And so when they asked for questions, who would like to ask a question, I put my hand up, and I was the first one called on. So I said, his name was William Weiss. So I said, Mr. Weiss, I am moved. I can look around the room, I see we're all moved. You have a exceptional focus and commitment to ethics and to accountability, to justice and fairness and compassion. It's just so awesome that I feel, where did this come from? From your life. Where did you get this idea? I had no idea where he was going to go with it. I had a thought, I guess I should say. I thought maybe he's a brother in Jesus. But let him speak for himself. So in fact, that's what he did. He gave his testimony as a Christian. And how the Bible stories, even as a child, even though his parents never went to church, the neighbor lady brought him to church. And the Bible stories, he said, I learned, I was excited about, and I've never forgotten. Now, everyone knows I'm from Wheaton, and they know Wheaton's focus on the Bible, right? That's well known in our Chicago community. So everyone is staring at me like I had orchestrated this, like this was a rehearsed question and answer. And I had to explain to everybody one at a time, I had no idea where he was coming from. But when I greeted him afterwards, I gave him my card. I said, I'm at Wheaton. We want to develop an ethics center. He said, oh, good. Let's talk. So about 2 weeks later, I get this call from his PR department. And the woman says, the president's office over here at Ameritech says that we're supposed to have a collaboration between Ameritech and Wheaton College. And so I'd like to come over and see what that might be like. So for several years, we collaborated with a secular communications company. And the woman that was our partner in all this was not a churchgoer herself. And I said one day, what is it that makes this such a workable partnership? She said, I'm not sure. She said, I've just been told to do this by our president. But I think it's because the core values that Wheaton stands for are the core values that make the world work. She said, so I'm glad to be part of this partnership. Because she said, our wires go through every neighborhood. We care about every neighborhood. And Wheaton has the values that personally, I wish everyone would have.
Very interesting.
So, more often than not, they simply paid the bills directly, so we didn't see the cash, but what's the difference? Or they would, through their influence, be able to get speakers that we might not have gotten on our own, because it would have also co-sponsored by Ameritech, and some people would respond to that and even give a speech with no honorarium. So we had some really top people in the civil rights movement come to talk. We had top people in corporate leadership. And part of the way that I think we kept it real was on every platform we had both a practitioner, someone who is actual business decision maker or technology decision maker or government policy decision maker, and someone who's a scholar expert. Mm-hmm. And then the audience, students, and people from the Chicago community come to the events.
So that sounds like the emergence of what the trialogue was, right? So can you say a little bit more about what trialogue means?
Well, again, in my experience as a scholar, I think that very often we scholars can learn a lot more than we realize from the practitioners, people that are actually doing the work. And very often, the practitioners have higher standards than we might think. There are the many exceptions too. I'm not sugarcoating, but maybe to give a couple of models for this. Our first conference that we hosted as the Center for Applied Christian Ethics was in the fall of '82. And we had Tom Donaldson from Loyola University talk about the ethics of multinational corporations. And then we had on the panel, actually 3 practitioners, Bill Pollard, president of ServiceMaster, and an officer on the board of the college, Noel Kaplan, senior vice president of McDonald's Corporation, and Al Comani, something like that, but president of Inline Steel, all Chicago area-based corporations. And Donaldson presented really a stunning paper of high standards for international corporations that shouldn't be compromising just because they're in a third world country, that the value of humanity should be ultimate in every circumstance. And then he gave a case study. And so all these corporate leaders from major corporations, major important Chicago corporations, responded and typically affirming and then giving cases out of their own corporations that lived up to his standard, but then critiqued his interpretation of a case study. Basically, someone from an American corporation was sent to Peru to construct a highway, which would include several bridges and so forth through mountains. And he complained that he didn't have the resources to provide enough safety for all the workers to have safety against mudslides. And he expressed to Ohio and to the national American government that he thought his corporation was not doing the right thing, giving him the funds to do the right thing. And each of these corporate executives says, he's not a hero. He's not a heroic whistleblower. He should have just talked to his own corporation and said, his standards as an engineer require the expenditure of this additional money to protect human life. And they needed to simply accept that, since they sent him off to Peru to direct this program. So each of them took the side of the corporation that fired him because he's incompetent to apply his own engineering standards a few thousand miles away from home. So that the whole audience found fascinating. And I think it was, in the end, it was not clear whether he was a hero, this man in the story, in the case study, was a hero, or it was proper to fire him. But at least they heard both stories, both sides. And I think that's more important, that we recognize the multifaceted, especially the same kind of case that from an ivory tower, a very smart, responsible scholar like Tom Donaldson might see it, and from the challenging day-to-day decision-making of 3 exemplary corporate chiefs. Probably another one that didn't quite match that, but caught some of the spirit of it. We had a scholar, Robert Janetsky, who was also chief economist at Harris Bank, which doesn't exist anymore. I don't know what bank absorbed it. It was a huge Chicago-based business bank, strictly business. And he was the chief economist for Harris Bank and on President Reagan's Council of Economic Advisors. So he was more on the scholar side. And then we had Elmer Johnson, who was an attorney with Kirkland and Ellis in Chicago, and was made the general counsel of General Motors and senior vice president of General Motors. And the issue was, in economic decisions, should justice be a factor, or should it just be profit-making? And it was an amazing standoff between 2 articulate people, and clearly one more devoted to the actual corporate world, and the other one more the scholar, the economist, who's an advisor for a bank and for a president. But the questions, the Wheaton student questions, we filled science lecture hall, and there were people standing in the back. It was a huge moment, and I think the business department encouraged, if not required most of the students in different courses to attend, which helps. But the students, thankfully, I think, very thankfully, sided much more with Johnson, with the guy who says justice matters. And maybe if it's just survival, you've got a dirt poor country and just corporations that cannot really make it. There may be other issues that come up. But in America, we ought to always be looking at justice, always. And he was retooling General Motors to have a greater focus on the safety of the driver and passengers, and even partnering for the first time ever in all of history, partnering between the corporate auto manufacturers and the auto insurance companies, because they had the same customers. So, but the most stunning moment was at the end, after I closed it out, thanked the authors, and again, the speakers, and again, this trialogue tension. So you had a practitioner, mostly scholar, and an alert audience, the great Wheaton College students, and people from the community, from all over Chicago, or a few people. But when it was all, everyone started to move out, this woman who was sitting in the back, I had no clue who she was, middle-aged and some, I guess. She is just, as fast as she can, coming down those steps, looking right at me. And I'm trying to see there's no back door out of here, right?
Not at our level.
So anyway, I stood there, greeted her. She said, I want you to know, I'm Robert Janetsky's wife. And I don't agree with anything he said tonight. And we're not raising our daughters to think that way either. Isn't that great?
It's fascinating, yes. So with the emergence of the center, what have you seen since then? So you were at Wheaton until when?
89.
Until 89.
10 years.
So throughout your time at Wheaton and through now, just in keeping with the label we gave to this evening, what are some of the things that you've seen as ethical issues that emerged and were important then, but perhaps fell out of the same level of attention or weren't as trendy as others emerged?
Sure.
What are some of those?
I think two come to mind immediately, but probably 8 deserve some attention. As a child, I became aware of racial injustice in a big way. Hard to describe. So I articulated that about a month ago on Christianity Today on the web, not in print, but on the web. So you might look for my name, and but basically, I was how to put it? When I went to Central High School in Grand Rapids, from elementary school, I had such a bad experience in elementary school. I was like the dumbest kid because I couldn't see the chalkboard for 3 years until someone realized I needed glasses. And I'm dyslexic, so it's a challenge. And then I became convinced I could never learn, as a lot of children in racially biased circumstances. So here I am, a straight A student now, finishing up 7th grade and then into 8th grade and on. I was an honor student. But some of my best friends, from the band especially, were African American young people who were smart as could be. I could describe an algebra problem, and they could talk their way through it with a solution very rationally, just as we were walking down the sidewalk. And yet they were absolutely sick having to take general math one more year, learning the same stuff they'd been learning since 4th grade. Angry, frustrated, bored to death. So here, this 12-year-old 8th grader goes to his friend, a guidance counselor at the guidance counsel office. So she said, how can I help you, Paul? You're one of our star students. How can I help you? I said, well, I'm here for Jimmy Moore. I'm puzzled. He really hates general math, and yet when I give him problems that I'm doing in algebra, he gets it. He understands. So is there a way he could take a test to at least evaluate? And this is like in the first 2 weeks of school. So it wasn't like, starting something in the middle of the year. I said, is there a way he could take a test to allow him to take algebra? Because he's, in my opinion, very able. And this guidance counselor said to me, how dare you tell me how to counsel students? You have no business coming into this office telling me about Jimmy or anybody else. Get out. That's the answer to racial justice. We don't want to hear about it. Well, that didn't calm me down at all. So I frequently, in junior high, high school, and ever since, been a pain in people's anatomy when it comes to racial justice. Even while I was here, there was no non-white person on the board. I had to campaign over about a 2.5, 3 year period. And others, Dorothy was with me on it, but I was, if I could say so, on the front lines, meeting constantly with the presidents and saying, you must. And here was a person that had 2 degrees from Wheaton, and she was the first black person in all of Alabama's history, the first black person to earn a PhD in an Alabama university. Can you imagine? And here she is doing her professional work on the west side of Chicago. So how is it that we didn't get her already? But it took me a long time. But once she's on, it was all very positive.
You made that trip together.
Yes. Dorothy's was my cheerleader, coach, and you were probably encouraging Dr. Chase as well.
What's interesting to observe about that is, what I was telling you at dinner, is that, if you look at Christian ethics texts were apparently not quite as animated as you are about the topic of race.
For shame.
So everybody, this is for the camera and everybody here, just go look at a survey of Christian ethics texts and then find out how many actually have race as an actual Christian ethics topic.
Sure.
And you're going to find a small percentage.
Sure.
Probably less than 20%.
Sure.
So it's interesting that you're right. It's always been an issue. But it's interesting how it's been, for whatever reasons, not at the forefront of what's being articulated in Christian ethics text. And it's important to say this, whether it's liberals or conservatives.
Oh, absolutely.
Because sometimes people may think, well, at least in more liberal institutions, people care about this, etc. It's like, well, why don't you read the Christian ethics text and come back and talk to me?
Sure.
Because you'll actually discover that it's not covered so much over there. Well, so it's interesting that's one of the topics. So what's another topic that
if I could push this other one a tiny bit further.
Yes,
Again, looked at my article on CT, but my pastor growing up was judging negatively Dr. King from the pulpit, judging negatively the whole civil rights movement. And yet I knew so much different. And still I was very active as a leader in the church for lots of ways. But we won't get into the details. A lot of those are in that article. But also Christianity Today reported in detail the march from Selma to Montgomery. And then how Billy Graham, motivated by the terrible violence and yet the issues, the cameras focused on Selma and Montgomery, Alabama, that in a 3-month period he organized a crusade for Montgomery. And there, as in all the other crusades, to have an integrated choir, integrated seating in the stadium, integrated team of ushers, integrated pastoral presence on the platform. And I'm thinking, so here I am getting all this garbage from the pulpit in the megachurch I grew up in, and needing some help. And just when I needed that help, CT has all these articles, which I quote in this essay, from 1965. And when I saw that, I was emboldened to do more of what God had guided me to do. But then speed forward from 65 to 2004. How many years is that? 39 years, right?
Yes, because
So
I was born
here I'm on the
in
board
65,
of the National Association of Evangelicals, representing 40 million evangelicals. And I love the organization. It's amazing, getting people to talk together, listen together, collaborate together. And we were organizing a set of principles for civic engagement. And that includes being pro-life, reducing drastically the number of abortions, pro-marriage, one man, one woman, one God, human rights, protection of the poor, nonviolent conflict resolution, creation care. I'm missing one. But anyway, and I wanted to add, I pushed hard to add, with lots of examples, lots of good reasons, racial reconciliation as a core principle for the NAE. Because I was not only a member of the NAE, I was a member at the same time of the Black Evangelical Association, Black National Evangelical
NBE
Association.
there, yeah.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
Ruth's
Yes.
organization.
Yes.
So at any rate, I'm a pretty persuasive person, I think. I had great examples, tons of biblical background, and I couldn't convince them. That was in 2004. We revisited everything in 2007. I still was on the board. I still could not convince them. And I really feel bad. I feel I've let a lot of people down. It should have happened. What could have I done better? But in 11 months ago, in October 2018, guess what they just added 11 months ago as a core principle for evangelical civic engagement? Racial reconciliation. And I got a phone call from the vice president saying when they did that, right away, hey, we finally added your principle in. Anyway, but Christianity Today itself did a survey about the time when we were writing that, and 90% of, roughly 91% of European American evangelical people felt there were no more civil rights issues. But if you add, and in the same survey, they interviewed African American evangelical people, and 90% said civil rights is still an ongoing challenge. Racial issues are still an ongoing challenge. And since I was in 8th grade, I've been on that side with passion. I pastored a church in Virginia before I came to Wheaton. And I've written about that too. I could send you an article that you could make available. But the parsonage, the church was a church of 300. And Dorothy and I dig back to that area too. But a church of about 300 souls. And it was the biggest church in a 20-mile radius, southeast of Charlottesville. And the headquarters for the KKK, for a 3-county area, was less than a half a mile from the parsonage for that church. And I knew there were members of our church that went to KKK meetings. But God protected us. We spoke His truth clearly with love. Well, a lesson I learned over and over I learned time enough to not get beat over the head by it, is Paul saying in Ephesians 4:15, speak the truth in love. And a lot of times I had the truth I wanted to speak, but didn't have a way to say it in love. And the Lord helped me to keep my mouth shut till I could say it with love. So that even though my wife's life and mine were threatened, even though we ran into all kinds of crises, the fruitfulness of taking a stand was noted throughout the region. And it was amazing. You could see the hand of God transforming that community. I could give a couple examples, but it's not really related directly to Center for Applied Christian Ethics. But I learned, before I came to Wheaton, I learned how deep a spiritual battle fighting racism is. And the people on the other side are very serious people. So I do think, and that's why several of our conferences dealt with race. In the spring of '84, we had a 3-day conference on racial issues in the Graham Center Auditorium. And I think every department sent students for different sessions. And we had top national leaders in civil rights from Dr. King's time. And it was appropriated in '84 because it was as if the 55th, as if the 55th birthday of Dr. King. He would have been 55 in the spring of 1984. So it was done in his honor. And, you know, I got pushback from some faculty, like, why are we honoring Dr. King, whatever. It's sometimes shocking how uninformed people can be. But nevertheless, God blessed it. And it was a great awakening time for a lot of the students. And to really hear directly from the movers and shakers that made a difference. Joanza Kunjufu, who I think is not so able to get around, but an expert on the challenges of educational systems within black communities. He spoke here twice.
Really? Interesting.
And again, I got some pushback, but if
Oh,
there wasn't pushback,
I'm sure you did. Yeah.
if there wasn't pushback,
I'm sure you did.
then we're not doing nothing. All right? Even if brothers and sisters push back, it's and I'm always all ears. I believe in open dialogue. That trialogue can work with someone who's totally opposed to what you're doing, but still is part of a dialogue that's got to go somewhere. Most of the time in a positive direction.
Can you? Because I want people to ask a couple of questions. Can you name a few of the other issues that are important? I mean, the race thing, I'm glad that you given that attention because, as I noted, you know, if you roll the dice and open an ethics text, you're probably more likely than not going to get any guidance about that.
Sure.
So what are some of the other ethics topics that you observed?
One that we give a lot more attention to is what I call creation care. I'm also one of the founders of the Evangelical Environmental Network. And we're not crazy environmentalists. We profoundly believe in the issues of the environment. We take seriously climate science. But long before climate science, the Creator said to our earliest two ancestors, you're the stewards of the whole earth. Do your job, right? And I believe there are 4 themes in Scripture, and I've said this before the Democratic caucus in the House of Representatives in Washington. They gave me an hour and a half to talk about this. Because their question was, is creation care or environmentalism in the Bible? I'm thinking, my first reaction, not to them, was like, duh. Open your Bible. But there are 4 themes. I even have this diagram that I think helps people remember. And I prepared copies, actually 2 versions of the diagram, gave them out to 150 Congress people in this caucus meeting. And the 4 themes that are Genesis to Revelation, one is the one that we just mentioned, that God has made all of us people His stewards. We're accountable for how we treat His creation. And we're given the power to do good things with the creation. But secondly, God made everything good. And if you mess it up, my parents always said, if you mess it up, you ought to clean it up. That's pretty basic human development, right? We should have learned that a long time ago, all of us. Same with the creation. We mess up something, we got to clean it up. And that's certainly a theme in Scripture. Paul talks about that pollution. The creation is crying out for the redemption. in the middle of Romans 8. And he talks about depletion and pollution in that passage, long before contemporary science. So that's a good reference too. So here, the goodness of creation, we mess it up, we ought to clean it up. Third, a great theme in the Hebrew Scriptures and New Testament, a great theme is to love our neighbor as ourselves. And as Jesus interpreted, it could be your neighbor in another continent. It doesn't have to be just your next door neighbor. Wheaton can be seen as a reminder of the old days when the neighbor didn't count. Because the founders of Gary, Indiana, were living in Wheaton, upwind from all the polluted smoke coming out of the steelworks and other factories in Gary. You have to hold your breath in the old days. I think they cleaned up a lot. But if you're coming from, say, Michigan to Wheaton, going through Gary, you can hardly breathe for about 10 minutes. Back in the day, I think they fixed it up a lot. But Gary and Wheaton lived in Wheaton, founded a bank called the Gary Wheaton Bank. Is that still around? Changed the name. Anyway, in the old days, it was the Gary Wheaton Bank that ran almost all the banks. And breathing fresh air because they were upwind from all that awful effluent coming out of their factories in Gary, Indiana, and being blown further east. Well, I think people who own factories ought to live downwind from the factory and then pay what it costs to clean up the stuff that comes out of their smokestack. Because otherwise, the hidden cost, people breathing that stuff in, we're paying a cost for these men to make a profit. Does that make sense? So, at any rate, it's a good reminder. And then the fourth point, which is the one that moves me even more than the others, is that God dwells in his creation. Yes, he's transcendent, above creation, but in Christ, he was incarnate, and he remains incarnate, remains dwelling in creation. Also, the Bible says, in him all things hold together. Colossians 1:17. So if he's the one, he's the cosmic glue, and we abuse creation, he has a right to take it personally. So why are we thinking we can get away with it? Or in Hebrews chapter 1, verse 3, he upholds the world through his powerful word. If he's upholding the whole world through his word, how dare we mess it up? Out of just bare respect for the deity, for our Creator, for our Savior, we ought to be very involved. Now, what particular policies do we need? I think that's where we diverge from most ecologists. I don't believe the spotted horned-toed owl or whatever it was that was shutting down whole logging operations in the northwest America.
Yes.
I don't think that was worth the sacrifice of all those jobs and cheap material. People are the most precious part of God's creation. Give an example. When I was at the University of Virginia doing my PhD, I was very involved in an ecology group. I'm a member still of the Sierra Club. All right? So I'm a card-carrying ecologist. But they wanted me to join them in writing up a statement against the highway department building Highway 64 across Afton Mountain. Because Highway 250 was just a really dangerous highway. Fog. I mean, there were people killed every year because that mountain was just foggy too much, and people were going too fast. Curves were pretty sharp. And there were probably 2 or 3 dozen people killed every year because of the awful quality of Highway 250 going over Afton Mountain. And Highway 64 was going to straighten that out. But they said, no. Just think of all the beavers that will have their homes disrupted. Think of all the deer that will have to learn new paths or create new paths. I'm saying, so? How about 3 dozen lives next year? And I wasn't able to convince all of them. I convinced a lot, so we never issued a statement. All right? I convinced them not to issue the statement. But to me, there was no comparison. I love beavers. In my town, it's the mascot. Do you know that? New York City has a mascot on the city seal, and it's a beaver. There's a story behind that. It's a mascot of the Netherlands, too, where my relatives came from. And they first founded New York. So they kept the mascot, even though they changed the name.
Yes.
But of course, the beaver, hardworking, dealing with water and dry land a lot. In New York City, 4 of the 5 boroughs are on islands. You know, so it's beavers are heroes. But back to the point. While we care about all kinds of animals, people are at a whole different level. And I think we don't have to just kiss up to whatever Sierra Club says or other ecologists say. A biblical ecology would be much smarter, much more oriented to both taking care of creation and a vibrant economy going forward. And
So in that regard, because sometimes the wedge issue with that is people feel like you're deciding between, in the interest of the example you gave, beavers and owls and deer, you're deciding between them and corporate interests, right? I mean, that's the way that it gets pitched, right? So that if you don't, if you say, who cares about the beavers, let's say, but you're enabling the profiteering of corporate America, right? The flip side is all people care about is momentary profiteering, and they don't care in the long run about the environment or making species extinct, etc. So, I mean, it sounds like you're trying to that you are looking for a middle way through that. But how do you navigate that? Because at least in terms of the public face of these things.
Oh, sure.
That's the way that works.
Politicizing these issues is really messy. It's hard to have a rational conversation right now because of people who are just gung-ho about the so-called Green New Deal, and those of us that see huge issues with that. Because if you shut down business by cutting off all carbon-based fuels, how are you going to pay for all the remediation needed? It's idiotic. It's like none of these people ever took Economics 101. So we favor cleaning up the smokestacks, having clean coal, doing all those things doesn't require being fooled. But it does require focus, attentiveness, investment, looking forward to the world that we want our children, our grandchildren to live in, and not only ours, but because the air that we breathe will soon be in Asia, in Africa, in Europe, that we care about the air quality for the whole world, everybody's children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and therefore we're going to clean it up, but we're not going to kill the economy in the process.
So you do want, what you're saying, to sort through strategies for attending to managing things that harm the environment.
Huge.
But not at certain costs.
Right.
Is that a fair way to put that?
Well, to measure the costs. Back to Charles Malik. There is no perfect solution. Right? So let's look for the least bad decision. And we're blessed with clean natural gas that's just pushed forward. It's so much cleaner than coal or oil to burn. So God, this is a Kairos moment. God has given America using the natural gas to fuel a growing economy where unemployment is low for every ethnicity, the lowest ever. And for women, unemployment is, I think, the lowest ever or near the lowest ever. So we have a lot to be thankful for. That's a gift of God. Don't give, Charles Schumer or Donald Trump the credit. God enabled us, I think, by planting ideas in people's heads, and they ran with them. And who knows what ideas smart people in this room have made up or shall to bless others. Sand has been around forever, since the creation. God talked about sand when he talked to Abraham, right? But silicone has got a whole new use, which is sand, right? Processed, manufactured in a special way. So the resources we need the eyes to see more and more what resources there are. And typically, it's not an either or. Either kill jobs but save the environment, or keep the jobs and have a deadly environment. No, there's always a third way. So there's some way to rise above a false dilemma. Mm-hmm. But that takes prayer, takes creativity, often takes hard work, research, but always.
Okay. Let me see if we have any questions from the audience.
Please.
Does anyone have any questions for Dr. DeVries?
You finished the list of 8? You didn't quite.
No, we've only gotten to 2. So can you list the other 6 verses? 6 verses.
Right.
We don't have the Bible. The other 6 issues.
I'm going to take a cheat sheet to...
Cheat sheets are all right.
Be sure because I was missing one a moment ago. Actually, I personally have 10. So if I could be permitted to mention all 10.
You can read each one of them.
Okay.
Go right ahead.
So, in no particular order, but to nurture family life and protect children. Protect sanctity of human life. I think that in New York, you can kill a baby that's already born if the parents don't want it. If it's, for example, a product of a failed abortion. And in Virginia, too, tragically. They say Virginia is for lovers. That's not a loving way to treat a newborn. So I think we live in a crisis moment in terms of abortion. I think Republicans have been ill-advised to always be against all abortion for their platforms for the last several elections. That's just stupid. There are places for abortion. But far rarer, way rarer than our country allows. So anyway, family life and protect children, nurture family life, protect children, sanctity of human life, reduce abortions, pursue lasting reconciliation, especially in racial relationships, seek justice and compassion, especially for the poor and vulnerable, safeguard human rights is number 5. 6, non-violently resolve conflicts and build peace-creating solutions. 7, care for all of God's creation. And I believe I care for God's creation even if I'm willing to, in particular cases, value human life more than beaver's life. I still care for every part of creation. I'd rather not sacrifice any of them. By the way, as a kid, I raised doves, homing pigeons, turtleneck doves, African ringneck doves, parakeets, canaries, turtles, ducks, rabbits. I love animals. So.
We have that for posterity.
Okay.
So
develop religious freedom and liberty. That's the one I forgot. How could I forget? Religious freedom and liberty of conscience.
So before we move on from that, so do you mean religious freedom for people who aren't Christians?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, I just wanted to say that because I don't think that people always think that Christians mean, when they say religious freedom, that they mean religious freedom for anybody that's not Christian, right? So at least the way that I think it comes off.
Absolutely.
Now, I'm sure if people were asked, well, this is what you really mean.
Sure.
They might say, sure, I mean it for other people.
Sure.
But I think the reputation suggests that Christians only care about it for them, maybe for Jews as well, but mainly for themselves. So I just wanted, to get
Oh, absolutely. No question. No ambiguity.
Yes, clarity about that. Yeah.
In fact, I think that as part of a biblical point of view, that no one is forced to the gospel. It is whosoever will may come. It's still an invitation. If someone's forced to go to church, forced to get baptized, that ain't Christian baptism.
Well, and that goes against, at least in our country, that's the reason for the Establishment Clause, right? You're not forcing you to be a Catholic or an Anglican, or if you're over there with Roger Williams, a Baptist.
Sure.
You know, so.
Or in the Bronx, Ann Hutchison. How many are familiar with the Hutchison Highway? Hutchison River? Maybe the only river and the only highway, to my knowledge, in America named for a woman. And what was her life? She was kicked out of Massachusetts because she wanted to teach the Bible to Native Americans. And they thought they weren't human. The official rule in Massachusetts at the time was Native Americans aren't human, so why would you teach the Bible to animals? And she wanted to include men, even European American men, in her classes. And they had a pretty narrow view about that sort of thing, too. So she got kicked out of Massachusetts and ended up in Bronx and was one of the founders of the Bronx. An amazing woman of clarity and courage. So look her up. Defend religious liberty, and absolutely, we must defend it for all. And more people will come to Jesus in that circumstance because they're not coming to Jesus if we're trying to force Jesus on them. And then number 9, make restorative justice the primary purpose of correctional programs. Too often it's retributive justice. Somehow they got to pay back for hurting somebody or murdering somebody or whatever. That's never going to happen. But how do we restore people? How do we bring their humanity back to a godly framework? We have helped, in New York anyway, we've helped highlight the best penitentiary in the world is Shamong Prison in South Korea, run by a not-for-profit organization called the Agape Foundation. The Koreans even use Greek. Agape as the name of the foundation. And the government needed to save money, so they offered to pay just partial what it would cost to run a penitentiary to the Agape Foundation. The Agape Foundation was not concerned about saving the government money, but they were concerned to save men. And so when a new convict is brought into Shamong Prison, they greet him with a huge barbecue and with hugs all over the place. Every new inmate gets a bear hug from the warden and from others. And they use their name, not numbers. And everyone takes educational, vocational training, job ethic training, not just skill training. And Bible studies are available if you want to come. So it's not pressured, not required. It's religious liberty there. The men that are sent there are on average, 80% of them are not Christian. Clearly not Christian. Only 20% say they're Christian. But they choose that because the Christians that run that penitentiary love people. So they want to be in a penitentiary. They don't want to be in a penitentiary at all. But if they're going to be in a penitentiary, they have the right to choose. And there's a long waiting list to get into Shamong. Isn't that great?
Fascinating.
And guess what the word Shamong means? Here's your first lesson in the Korean language. It means hope. Isn't that beautiful? And the recidivism rate is less than 5%. In New York, it's 70%. You let someone out of prison, within 3 years they'll be back in prison. In other states, a little more, a little less. But in America, it's typically 60 to 70%. Can you imagine 5%? And these are all violent felons. So If we do it right, restorative justice makes sense. As long as we don't feel we have to get back at them some way. But to see in each person, even some awful criminal, to see the image of God and to restore that image.
It's arguably working to further humanize them, yes?
Absolutely. And among other things too, they're allowed to have, it's all men, that's just the way it's designed. They have women's prisons too, but Agape just runs this men's prison. But if a man has had a whole month of good behavior, showing up at the classes regularly and all the other good behavior issues, helping out with the kitchen, whatever is necessary, he has the right to have his wife and children come and stay overnight in an apartment in the penitentiary. And have several apartments for that purpose. Talk about a motivation, right? Once a month, your wife will visit and you sleep together. You are doing life together. And you've got your kids coming. What a motivator for building that humanity back up rather than cutting everyone off.
Kind of starving them, yeah.
You got to admire the Koreans when they do something. They can be smarter than us. But we can learn.
We can learn a lot.
And we're pushing for that sort of thing as much as possible in New York. The whole attitude of restorative justice, which means churches have to be involved with convicted criminals, especially the younger ones. And we can even keep them out of jail if the pastors and churches will help monitor them, work with them, have a really proactive program. The district attorneys are willing to even stand for them to not go to jail, but if they don't live up to their commitments, it's jail. So it's serious, but it can be very restorative too. And then the 10th one is redeem skill, substance, and style of communication. Really take how we talk to one another, how we talk to our enemies,
yes,
competitors, whatever, to be more what the Bible says it should be, which is to be uplifting, to be encouraging, to be filled with the gospel songs and hymns, as Paul says in Ephesians. And very practically, we have to relearn some of the basics of civic discussion in our churches and in our schools.
Okay, so that's the 10 issues, not 8 actually.
Does that help?
So now that we've got those, are there any questions for Dr.?
Could you explain some of the modus Pauline logic with the professor tenure, the divorce issue?
Yeah, if you say whoever is divorced commits adultery, we don't want any adulterers around. That's modus tollens, right? So we're denying the it's not antecedent, postcedent, I guess. We're denying the postcedent, forcing us then to deny the antecedent. You know, if divorce is adultery, divorce is equal to or produces adultery, we don't want adulterers, then we don't want any divorced people. Modus tollens. Simple. And the irony is at the time that this brother, faculty member, was pushing that and repeating it over and over, as if no one had ever heard of modus tollens, but it sounds very, very trustworthy to have a Latin term for your argument, please. And I was the only one at that moment who taught symbolic logic, who taught formal logic rather than just informal logic. So that's why I said, you have to start with saying that these are propositions before you plug them into a modus tollens, and that's not the way Jesus is talking. He's using hyperbole to awaken us to realize that we are all sinners. We are all broken, however good we think we are. And I think the divorce one was very important because they had cheapened divorce. It's not really that important back in Jesus' time. But whoever looks at someone of the opposite sex with lust has committed adultery. That hits everybody, I think. Anyone here never had a feeling of lust? See, it worked again. But yeah, I think that kind of reality. Another thing, I grew up in a church that emphasized doctrine, and I believe in doctrine.
Thank you. I appreciate that as somebody who teaches theology.
Good. I teach theology. I teach doctrine. But the church did not teach ethics. And you get repeatedly throughout the epistles, about the first half of the epistle, Paul is doing great doctrine, whether it's Ephesians or Philippians or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
First half, roughly, is powerful doctrine. But the last half is how this affects behavior. And that's why we have a Center for Applied Christian Ethics. I, with Pat Warhane, who was the dean at the time, she and I had a little argument, and I lost. I'm not angry about it, but I lost. I believe if you say Center for Christian Ethics, of course it's applied. Why would Christians just sit around and talk abstract ethics?
You will get no argument from me.
But of course, we all know that's what we do all the time in church and other places. Rather than talk about what are we doing now? How are we going to change this now? Which brings up another strength that we created, and I'd love to see it restored. We identified every year for one term, we had a course on creating case studies out of raw material. And the raw material was starting with Chicago Tribune, Chicago Sun-Times. And the students were supposed to read those regularly. And then we would meet, and the students that took this course had to have an ethics class from one of the departments. It didn't have to be philosophy or Bible, it could be any ethics class. But then we would isolate issues, right now issues, going on in Chicago, in our biggest classroom of Wheaton, the whole city of Chicago. We had a little disagreement once about what's the biggest classroom for Wheaton College. Honey Rock, people were saying they had the biggest classroom. Well, that's pretty good. And I let them explain why. Mm-hmm. This was at a faculty meeting. It was kind of a fun faculty meeting. So I let them finish their argument. And I raised my hand and I said, well, we have actually one that's a little bigger, the whole city of Chicago. Because there's so many vibrant, exciting, riveting case studies happening all the time. So one time it was on racial issues, which is a recurring theme. We had 2 or 3 conferences related, at least annual conferences, and we did some things with faculty, some faculty workshops, internal, on racial sensitivity, which, I don't know if we have time for, but I could give some descriptions of how those went. I think they were very helpful and had the full support of the administration in making it happen. But back to this case. So we're looking for racial issues in different shapes, different forms. So in the paper, there's this news that Sears Company, which then back in the 80s, early and middle 1980s, was a big, vibrant company. Had issues.
I remember those days of Sears. Yes.
So they had this huge warehouse in Lawndale, which is one of the big neighborhoods of Chicago. Unemployment, actual de facto unemployment at that time anyway, in that neighborhood was like 70%. But they don't count people that don't show up to the unemployment line every week. Then you're not even counted. So we had a graduate, Wheaton had a graduate called, I can't think of his name right now. He was the brother of the chaplain. What was his name? Anyway, he had a pastor. He was the pastor of Lawndale Community Church, So he was a good contact. But it was this huge warehouse for Sears. They were shutting down and relocating off in Normal, Illinois, if anyone knows where that is. Anyone know where Normal, Illinois is? Okay. Because there's a teaching school which used to be called a normal school. But anyway. But they were pulling up this employment, place of employment that was employing several hundred people in Lawndale. Just taking it out completely to put it in Normal. So what difference does this make? So I laid this out as a possible case. A couple of students jumped to it. And you students, the students here, and others that share my love for Wheaton students, underestimate the respect and appreciation that you are deserving in the Chicago area. They went into Lawndale and they went to the hospital to find out what are the issues. Because in an emergency room, you see a lot of the issues for a neighborhood. Not just usual scratches and burns, but all kinds of dimensions of psychological issues, social issues, and so forth. So they interviewed a couple of, they were given permission to interview a couple of doctors there. And then the doctors said, we got to do better than this. Come back, next Tuesday, 10 o'clock in the morning, and we're going to have another meeting. So sure, they said, we'll come back. And they came, and those two doctors they were talking with recruited another 15 doctors to meet with our two students to talk about what the issues are in Lawndale from their professional point of view. And it was hugely revealing. They went to the congressman representing that area. They went to the city council person representing that area. They went to Chicago manager's office to talk to people working on issues in Lawndale. They went to the unemployment office. They covered the waterfront. And they produced a superb case study of what's happening to Lawndale if Sears goes ahead with its plan to shut down their warehouse. And we sent copies of this to everyone that cooperated with us and to Sears. Never heard back from Sears. But it was a very enriched education experience for these students to recognize if you raise the right issues, people will collaborate to give clarity. And there were similar issues like with the public housing, where there was clear discrimination in terms of distribution of resources. And we were able to follow through. Irene Johnson, who was a resident of one of the public housing projects, outspoken Christian that we ended up partnering with on a few things. She was a tremendous help. But racism has many ugly heads. And believe me, I'm sure that whatever Sears justified he used to justify shutting down this very precious warehouse in Lawndale, there was a profound racial issue over that. Because if they said, well, it's a little dangerous here, well, hire a few guards. If you have guards already, hire a couple more, right? Which is more expensive, that or rebuilding completely miles away where they're further away from their stores? This is not complicated. Did we uncover a racial issue? I think we did. But the students did the work. So that's why I find not just studying case studies. I've written dozens of case studies. Business case studies, education case studies, etc. But the best case studies I've ever seen were the ones that Wheaton College students did. Starting off with Chicago Tribune and knowing there's an issue here and going out better than investigative reporters really searching for the truth and getting huge cooperation from the people.
A lot of cooperation, it seems. Yes. So we're almost out of time. Is there other questions for
Two more questions?
I wonder if you reflect on the recent events
Mm-hmm.
Have you thought through that continuance?
Right. I have. Did you want Vince to answer that too?
I mean, I always have something to say.
Oh, good. Please go ahead.
But since at least too much to hear you answer it because of being a UVA graduate, having been to Charlottesville.
And living
Yes.
surrounded by KKK people.
Exactly.
Well, Charlottesville the event was much worse than the media has covered. And I've written about that, and in the essay I did on that, I give links to very objective reports that nobody's talking about. So the KKK, awful perspective, mean-spirited, evil worldview. They try to coat over with sometimes a little gospel talk, but it's clearly anti-Christian. And truly, as I pastored, people came to me in tears, and I didn't know exactly who it was that was involved with KKK, but people coming to me with tears saying, I just told them I have to quit the KKK because God has got my heart and I can't stand with them anymore. So I saw people change dramatically. But there were two other groups that made this thing worse. One of those groups was the mayor of Charlottesville and the police were a huge part of the problem that contributed to the death of the one young woman. The mayor said, stand back. Don't protect the KKK people. If other people want to beat up on them, just stand back and let the Antifa fascists, the so-called anti-fascists.
They're anarchists. Yeah.
Right. That wear masks, and the police should say, no way, we're arresting you for wearing a mask at a demonstration. But they allowed it. So the police stood back and let the Antifa people physically beat up within half an inch of their life, the KKK people. So it only raised the violence, the whole attitude of violence and lack of civility to the nth degree. And this was the mayor, and the police went along with it. And by the end of the year, that was middle of August of 2 years ago. By the end of the year, the state police of Virginia issued a 120-page statement so critical, the Charlottesville police, so critical of the mayor, that it's a shame it's gotten no public exposure. But so it takes often more than one movement to make a mess. And believe me, I have no heart for the KKK people. All right? They wanted to kill me. I'm not defending them, ever. But there's no reason to stand back and let the Antifa people beat up anybody, as hateful and ugly as the KKK people are. The Antifa are just as ugly.
And obviously a lot of the people that were showing up for the protests that were with Richard Spencer and others, I mean, they weren't exactly unarmed either, right? I mean, so you had.
No.
I mean, I agree with you that no one's thinking about when the event was happening whether Antifa was going to show up, because all the attention was to, these largely younger white men parading with torches saying Jews will not replace us,
right,
and all these other things.
Right.
And so, which of course, kind of looks like the Nuremberg rally or something. And so that obviously concerns people.
Sure.
Torches at night, I think. But it's true that there's attention on that. Nobody's even thinking about what happens if anarchists show up.
Right. But the mayor did say, if the anarchists come, step back and let them beat up on the racists. But really horrific to me, as a double graduate of University of Virginia, master's and PhD, that the university would allow the KKK to march on the grounds. There's no public right to enter the university grounds, the university campus, and march for anything, even motherhood or apple pie. that they had no right, and yet, and I have eyewitnesses for this, they came out marching, and huge numbers of university security knew they were coming because they showed up to watch and never did anything to stop them. Shame on the University of Virginia. That's hard for me to say, but it's still true. So the whole thing was a cauldron of mistake upon mistake upon mistake. So again, I'm not saying a kind word about the KKK. I just think.
I mean, I think it does show why we continue to have a hangover about race, though, because, most of the history of the country's been racist. So the idea that 50 years later, when hundreds of years, at least 300 years of the country, if we want to say 16, 19, 400 years, if 345 of those years have been putting in place racial superiority, and by law, what are your proper expectations after 54 or 55 years? Especially when last time I checked, there's no record of any great wave of religious revival that took place in the 1960s around race.
Oh, there was.
Well,
there was.
Well, there may have been some, but my point is that not that much among evangelicals, for sure. And, I'm not saying nobody's changed their mind. My point is that whatever change that has happened, to expect that change to be as if you didn't have the prior 345 years,
I understand.
is kind of unrealistic.
Yeah.
Almost to say that, so when this happens, and arguably when this happens 4 to 5 years after Trayvon Martin and Michael Brown, and the way that that's led to, I would say, greater attention to arguably what's already there, what's already the experience of some minorities in terms of what goes on in their neighborhoods, police, etc. All those things together create, combined with social media, a greater cauldron, so to speak, that then you get this kind of thing happening at UVA, and people are like, how's this happening,
right,
et cetera, et cetera. And arguably, I guess if you want to throw something else, you could probably throw globalization in there too, but
right.
That's...
But I do think we're not advancing the cause, saying that our president is a racist just because he said there were good people on both sides. I wrote an article that there were bad people on both sides. The Antifa side, or on all three sides, the police, Antifa, and the KKK. But curiously, the protest in Charlottesville was initially to seek to keep this ugly statue of Robert E. Lee in the central park there of Charlottesville, which is really a kind of a weird statue. I won't describe it, but it's kind of weird. But it's a prominent statue in one of the main parks of Charlottesville. But in New York has had only one black governor, David Patterson. And he was interviewed a couple months ago, and someone said to him, well, what do you think about keeping Robert E. Lee's statue in that park in Charlottesville? And he says, you're not going to like what I'm going to say, but it needs to be said. And this guy, who's civil rights leader from birth, basically, I mean, he was just an articulate leader and a man who rose to the highest level of political power in New York State. He said, I honored Robert E. Lee because he never had slaves. He was opposed to slavery. He was willing to be the general because that was his community. But he was not pro-slavery.
That's true, but there are things you can read that Robert E. Lee said that didn't make him some abolitionist in mind. I mean,
right.
So I think we do need to qualify that.
Yeah, and I'm not making him. I'm not proposing
okay.
we
I'm
canonize
just
him.
saying because I know people for whom.
But
Robert,
you know what he did after the war.
Robert E. Lee is a sainted Christian person, etc. So I just want to say we need to make sure that we qualify that.
Governor Patterson said to this person, "Do you know what he did after the Civil War?" The person said, "No, I don't know anything." He said, "Well, he worked hard to find jobs, to help freed slaves find their way economically. He invested his life to benefit these people. So we got to tell the whole story. He's deeply flawed in all these areas.
Like most figures, or all. Yes.
Even biblical characters.
Except for Jesus, of course.
Right. But the point is, this ideology that we can only honor perfect people is sick.
Well, that's why a Wheaton College education hopefully is facilitating critical thinking, where you can, I like to say, even if a person is 99% wacky, if 1% is actually rock solid truth, admit the 1% is rock solid truth.
Sure.
Tell the truth about that and defend that 1%.
Right.
Even if you say the other 99% is for the birds.
Absolutely.
And I think that we are in this kind of idea where you have to have a kind of purity but sometimes it's the way that people get figures presented to them. They get figures presented to them. Read everything this person says, because basically this person walks on water. And then, of course, what they will discover is when you get to know that figure, the day of reckoning arrives where they said something or did something or didn't say something or didn't do something, and you're like, but they told me that they were perfect.
Yeah.
Right. So I think sometimes that we do need to find a way to encourage an ongoing active discernment.
Oh, absolutely.
With the complicated people that
critical thinking
that we're always dealing with. Yes.
Or whatever the right word is, clear-headed thinking. There's this idea of only honoring perfect people is at least a kind of weakness of people that want to call themselves progressive.
It's not just them.
But it's also, in the Quran, there's lots of stories about David, but there's no Bathsheba. There's a story of Jonah, but he did what the Lord said. The story of Abraham, but he didn't lie about his wife. The treasure we have in Scripture, where our exemplars are flawed like us, is a gift.
Yes. That's why I keep saying that, because
I'm with you on that.
I know. It's just that you said it's just important for prosperity.
Most of our.
Just that we make sure that we have that.
But how liberating.
Yeah.
So even for all of us flawed people, God can do amazing things.
And here's the thing. I think Christians ought to be leading the way and being the people who are like that.
Sure.
But I think it's generally the case that people are selective about when they want purity in terms of a model and when they don't.
Sure.
And evangelicals are leading the way in that, right? I mean, we could do a better job about that because we've got our own people that, we'll hey, read them, listen to them, they're whatever, they walk on water. I mean, everybody's got their people, and then when it's to your advantage, of course, other people are massively flawed. Therefore, they should be completely dismissed.
Right.
When we should be doing this discerning and saying, here's why these things are complicated matters. Just like when you were talking about going back to the environment thing, it's not as simple as profitability or protecting beavers.
Sure.
Right.
Well,
so,
And we're looking for a choice that is both and.
Yes.
And too often, when we're asked questions, is this or this, to make your choice, too often we just submit to the bad logic of the question, rather than saying, let's study this, let's look for what the other alternatives are. And in most cases, it's a third choice.
That's actually a great stopping point, because we've had a very, very long conversation. It's a very helpful, invigorating conversation. So, Dr. DeVries, thank you very much.
Been my
Good to have you here.
Good to be here.
Thank you all for coming. And that's a wrap.